Let's talk about corruption. It's a difficult subject, but it's an important issue. Corruption is seen as a deviation from a standard or a norm or an ideal, and in particular from the deviation from the standard and the ideal that certain things should be held in public and exercised for public good. Corruption implies misuse, but misuse of public goods and public office for illegitimate private gain. And political corruption is exactly the same, except it is the situation where politicians and people in the political system and the public administration system might seek private gain of an illegitimate nature rather than pursue the public good. Now, why talk about it? Well, it's difficult to talk about governance and good governance without talking about perhaps the biggest threat to good governance, which is corruption itself. Corruption is a threat in many senses. Most profoundly of all, it erodes public trust in political institutions, in public institutions. It encourages citizens themselves to become increasingly corrupt. Therefore, it grows as a kind of disease and eventually closes out the possibility of a public space where people can work together to pursue the public interest. And in extreme cases, as we know, it can mean that public finances become essentially the private finances of some dictator in some part of the world. Now, corruption derives from many causes and many factors. In some societies, the distinction between private and public advantage was never clear from the start, and therefore public misuse of public office is almost not understood as a misuse at all. In other situations, certain sectional interests, clan, religion, neighbourhood, place, are so strong and the state so weak that persons feel they should pursue the interests of their group rather than that of the entire country. And that sometimes can become also a form of corruption. Maybe not so private, though usually that goes with it, but a corruption in the sense that we're not treating all citizens equally, and we're not trying to maintain a uniform, open public space for all to participate in. Corruption is therefore a big problem. How can it be tackled? The reason we're dealing with the issue here in the context of governance is because a lot of work would say that you cannot simply pass laws, put in all kinds of controls, which themselves in a sense erode trust, but rather you must empower people to identify that corruption is wrong, that corruption is negative, that corruption is ultimately in no one's interest. If we understand ourselves as living together in society, that corruption is dangerous, and that corruption makes life pretty miserable for everybody. So awareness among citizens about the evils and dangers of corruption is important. Secondly, what can we do about it? Well, in addition to acting against possible individual acts of corruption, one of the best ways to prevent corruption is to ensure that government and the government system is held to account. To ensure that public policy, imperatives, objectives and actions are well understood, and to ensure that citizens indulge and engage in a discussion about what are public goods. In other words, that citizens are engaged, interested in public things, and therefore will be prepared in extreme cases to influence in order to ensure that public office holders act in the public good. Therefore, civic engagement, the development of non-governmental organisations, the development of individual citizen awareness about public things, civic education, all of these things are essential ground conditions to try to limit the spread of corruption and ultimately begin to reverse its effects. Therefore, the issue of facing corruption must inevitably be part of our reflection on governance and good governance, and be part of the motivation to try to ensure that citizens become more engaged, better informed, and therefore more active, and in some sense, legitimate sense, more